Was going to say we can get started and hopefully others will join us. I wanted to first start off by saying Dion sends his apologies, but they have rolling blackouts in South Africa. And this morning he sent me a message that unfortunately the rolling blackout was happening during this meeting time, so he will not be able to join us. But he did send some questions. So if nobody else has questions, I got some questions from him. So welcome everybody. Want to start off, there's a link in the chat that takes to our meeting notes, and we have underneath there if you want to put in your name for the attendance. And we'll start off with announcements before we get into the discussion. So a few of the things for announcements I have is NDSA, the 2022 year in review. If you wanted to know what NDSA was doing in the last year, it's a good blog posting that talks about all the wonderful activities and the progress that the organization has made. So there's a link in there for you to read all of that. The other thing is recently there's an institutional and organizational research data retention policy questionnaire. It's done by the University of California. There's a link in there about it, and what they're really looking for is to figure out what type of aspects, what type of retention policies places have, and that type of thing. It looks like it's going to be 8 questions, and it'll take about 2 to 3 minutes to complete. So it's not a time intensive, but they're gathering valuable data that is very much needed for everybody. And the last announcement that I have is Coalition for Networked Information, CNI. During their fall meeting, they recorded a lot of the sessions, and now all of those videos are available online. And there's a link there for you to go to, and you can see if there's anything of interest to you for there. So having said all of those announcements, does anybody else have any other announcements that they would like to make to the group? Okay, well then we will get going. What we decided today, we've always been trying different types of formats in our meetings. And so today it's going to be an open discussion. And what came forward was a look at, and of course, now I don't have it in front of me, about how to deal with raw formats, digital formats. How are you, have you dealt with them? Are you in the midst of dealing with them? And what are you doing? And so, I have a couple of questions, but I want to, if anybody else has questions, if you have experience you want to share, discovered problems, issues, whatever, the floor is open. And I also want to remind everybody that we are recording this meeting today. So it'll be available on our website shortly thereafter. So does anybody want to start us off today? Has anybody had it? Has anybody had a lot of experience with it and you've already dealt with it? Or are you in the midst of dealing with it? Or do you know you're going to be dealing with it? That's kind of the stage I'm at, because we're going to be getting a large photograph collection in that's over 100 years old. And I'm kind of getting a little bit concerned about the 1980s and 90s of their images and what format that they're stored in.
Brenda, are you talking specifically about raw digital?
We can talk about anything. That's what it started off as, the concept started off with thinking about raw digital that was in proprietary software and the issues of trying to think about how to long-term preserve them.
But I'm sorry, I meant photographs in
Yes,
particular.
photographs, yes.
Okay. Yeah, we are.
But if you want to talk
photographs.
about anything, if you want to talk about other than proprietary software, we can talk in general too, but yeah.
No, I think this is a real challenge. I recently reached out to a couple of forums because I wanted to know how other people were dealing with this. And I find that people do not want to talk about this.
That's what we're discovering too.
Yeah, because I think there is, so I will tell you, I'm happy to share like
Thank you.
the rabbit hole that I'm going down currently. And we cannot take terabytes of photographs in raw form. That's not sustainable. We don't have the capacity for that kind of storage. But there are some collections. So I think where we're kind of falling in this decision tree is that if the raw documents a creative process, then it's worth investigating preserving that raw format as opposed to like, migrating it to this Adobe pseudo raw format. But if there's no creative process, if that's not what the collection is about, then maybe that's not necessary. But I'm currently developing a policy around this, so
Oh,
good timing,
all
Brenda.
right. Well,
Great, thank
perfect.
you
Then you
so
have a
much.
lot. And are you
That
with
is
the, yeah, with the
DNG.
Adobe format, are you, it's DNG, right? Or yeah.
That's right.
Oh, yeah. And somebody put it in chat too. Okay, good. Yep. And Stephen, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, so to answer your initial question there, Brenda, while technically we will accept raw image formats, and we have a few, we don't have a lot, but they essentially come in as opaque, bit streams. We have not yet established any sort of standards for description or technical characterization of these things. So at most, without having to do sort of an archaeological investigation, what we're really providing is purely bit level preservation of these materials. Yeah. So it's putting the onus on some, our colleagues of the future to be able to make use of this, which is actually quite similar to what our current process is for dealing with forensic disk images. Although we are moving towards a more formal set of practices to deal with those in an appropriate way.
So it sounds like everybody's at the stage of trying to figure out their policies and procedures around this. Any other experiences? Well, I think Christina, you brought up something interesting because when I first started thinking about this issue, I wasn't thinking about the creative process, and I was really thinking about how do I just get it out of that format and not worry about preserving actually the raw format. Now you've got me rethinking a little bit here. And is that good or bad in my mind? Because what are we losing in that process, I guess? Nope, Stephen, all right.
Sorry,
No, great. We need
I always try to leave
you've
room.
got experience. This is great.
I always try to leave room for other people to talk first because I'm a bit of a loudmouth and I don't want to monopolize things. I mean, our general rule of thumb is that we always recommend keeping, the original thing, either the original born digital cap form or the original, best representation reformatted thing. For all the, we're all familiar with why we do that. It's in theory, that's the most information rich representation that we have. And it's, again, in theory, giving us the most flexibility and options for downstream activity. But, given that we don't really know a lot about these things that we're getting, perhaps that's a reasonable assumption to question. Would a more directly processed form in a more standardized and well-known format actually serve our purposes better?
I keep thinking about capacity and sustainability because we just don't have the capacity. And how can we do that? Jenny's got a comment in the thing saying we mentioned raw images in one of our topic notes at DPC, probably oversimplified as this is really aimed at an introductory level. The answer seems to be that it depends. That is the equitable answer, isn't it? It's always it depends. I agree with that. But thank you for that link also. Yep, Bill?
Hi, I work with Steven, so he's sweating now. But I've been interested in having an option where we can save raw images in rare cases. So for the most part, when we're digitizing things, we're supposed to stay out of the image. We're supposed to just take an image of what's in front of us, but there are exceptions. Negatives are the most significant exception. So there are times, so we send our staff into a digital darkroom and interpret these images that come out. It's not unusual to have negatives where the elements that the community that is going to be using these things is interested in are things in the shadows or glyphs or different things. So we have a couple of options. One of them is to, spend a lot of time, aka money, and try and tune these things as best we can to a researcher's needs who we're typically not that, informed about. Or one of the attractions of keeping DNGs as one of a few formats is that it preserves all the editing latitude that we had at the time that we were working with the file. That's not true once you make it a raster image and you make it a TIFF or make it a JPEG 2000. So that would be the rationale. There are lots of different raw files. Years ago, I looked up to see that there were 60 or 80 or something just for Canon. So these things, so I was interested in DNG. So DNG either works with the camera manufacturer to have a mechanism, an informed mechanism from going from their camera raw format into DNG, or DNG or Adobe tries to reverse engineer it when they can. So theoretically, you'd have less options than you would have if you were using the manufacturer's raw. But hopefully, by going into a more generic version of it, you'd have a better shot of opening it up. A few years ago, a little bit more than a few years ago, I was at a conference of image creation folks in libraries and museums, and the museums folks were already lamenting the fact that they weren't able to open up some of the raw images that they had captured early on.
It's something we just can't leave for our successors to take care of, even though we're dealing with a lot that our predecessors left us now.
Bill, in that case of not being able to open older materials, was that due to the fact that they didn't have the right software, or that they didn't know what the thing was, or what was the crux of the difficulty?
I think that over time, if it's a Sony file or a Canon file, I had a Canon S3 years ago. I don't suspect I think there's a good chance that whatever Canon has out there for dealing with their own raw formats, it might not, cover that. So I think that that's what they were dealing with. They certainly knew they had captured these images. They weren't bringing them in as born digital. These are ones that they'd made. It wasn't the only copy they saved. The finished thing that they had was a raster image that they processed out of the raw file, but they weren't able to open them up again. There are some raw converters, kind of generic ones and open source ones, where if you were a real weenie, maybe you could put in special information to try and get something out. But these were professionals that were at a loss. They couldn't render these things anymore.
Thank you. Jenny? Jenny, did you want to say something?
Yeah.
Yep, perfect.
Sorry. I'm keeping my camera off today. It's a bit later in the day here.
That's true.
But yes, so it's a really interesting issue, and I do think it does always depend, doesn't it? So as with so many questions like this, I mean, I would say whether to keep raw or not depends so much on the use case, like who will be preserving the images for, and what might they do with them, and is raw likely to be something that they need in the future? What value are the images? What are we likely to use them for in the future? But I always would sort of temper these decisions with consideration for the huge storage costs that we're going to add if we're going to be using raw as a file format or any of the raw file formats, and that kind of impact on the environment that I think needs to come into our decision making in digital preservation. You know, everything comes at a cost, doesn't it? It's a financial cost, but also it's a cost on the planet if we're going to be keeping raw images as a matter of course, as well as perhaps converting them into TIFF and something else as well, just as a belt and braces approach. So yeah, those were just my thoughts on the issue. But yeah, I don't think there's a single answer, is there, as to what might be the best way to approach this.
Oh, isn't that the truth? David?
Yes, I work with Bill. I came in a little bit late here. I think a few thoughts on that. I mean, one is why would you save the raw? Like, what's your purpose on that? Where we thought of it was when we were capturing negatives, where we thought of that as actually being like the negative, where you might future user may go back and decide they're going to make a different type of print from it to reinterpret that negative image. And then that would enable at the time of capture to do, maybe automated processing on them, be able to move through a collection faster that way. And if someone wanted to go back and do some more intensive editing on it, they'd have the raw file to work from. And the pro of the raw file is you have, the actual capture, and the kind of the minus of it is that it's like kind of a negative, an kind of a realized image, where like if you had an image that you'd match to an original, that would be your fully processed file, but the raw file wouldn't be matched to the original. And, different types of raw converters would interpret that image differently. So there'd be really no way to know exactly what it was. So if you didn't have the original again, you'd just kind of have information that would need to be interpreted in some way. So it's kind of, if you really feel there's a need to do that, that could be a good rationale for it. But if you're not planning on doing that, you'd be better with an image that was fully processed.
Wonderful information, Stephen.
So I'm sure folks will correct me when I misstate something here. But my understanding is that even the term raw is a little bit of a misnomer. I mean, it's not fully analogous to photographic negative, in the sense that it's not really what's just coming off the CCD sensor. My understanding is there's all sorts of signal processing that's going on. It's it's interpolating across sensor cells and so forth. So you're already sort of one step removed. I mean, it's deep down in the weeds. You'll never be able to get around it. But to a certain extent, raw doesn't necessarily represent the actual visual reality in the same way that a tangible negative would.
Right, that's true. There's always going to be something there. It is like, I'm sure you're correct, Stephen. There's some level of interpolation probably going on in there, but it is a non-demosaic file, I should say. So if you have a Bayer filter or a Fuji style filter on the sensor, that then just has to be, it's a one channel image. So there's not full red, green, blue information for every channel. It needs to be demosaicked in some way. And the raw file is pre-demosaicing, because that's going to happen in the processor.
I am learning so much, but I'm happy that we've been on the it depends conversation about how we're doing this, because it's making me feel better about the decision processes that we're going to have to make here. So has anybody else had experience that they want to share that they've been dealing with at their places, or questions that they have as they're grappling through this, like all of us are? If not, oops, this is just an aside. Okay. Oh,
Mhm.
he deleted them all. Yep. Very true, very true. I do have a couple of questions from Dion here. I think we've answered a couple of them. I guess one of them we touched a little bit on DNG, but he says, how do people feel about converting to Adobe's DNG format and using this as an option strategy for long-term preservation? Will the proprietary raw format still be around in 100 years? We've kind of touched on that a little bit on, on our thinking. Any other thoughts on that? We can't keep everything. Yes, Carol, I agree.
You can, to use, so you brought up the storage.
Yeah.
You can embed the raw file in the DNG file.
Oh, you can. Okay. Hmm.
Just to save even more
That
data.
I mean, it was going to be, it's like, wow, but interesting. And then some of his other questions are, how would you deal with migrating images from any of the lossless formats to a new storage medium, future proofing? Is DNG seems to be the format everybody's going to, or is that just what works the best in this situation? I'm the novice here in images, so. Yep. Bill?
We're not saving them. As I,
Yeah.
I mentioned earlier, I think there are some cases where, and David pointed out, where we could go through big collections at a lower cost and be less anxious about having a perfectly realized image that required some interpretation. But we're not envisioning, if we were to use it, that this would be something that anyone would go back to in a migration scenario. They would go back to the finished image. The use case would be that a researcher or somebody that wanted to do editing themselves could pull out an individual image or a small group of images and rework them. And so that would sort of scream for, if you were saving it, having them in low cost storage.
Okay. And then his other question was, has anybody had any issues with loss or damage and or color space and profile issues?
Well, the raw file doesn't have a color space really. That would be more the file that you had exported out. So that's before
Okay.
that stage.
Okay. I love it. People are putting some great links in the chat, so be sure to keep watch on that too for different resources.
I think it's not talked enough about how this is part of the total cost of stewardship, right? Because if you are preserving the raw file, that is however many gigabytes, and then you create a copy as an accessible, like a TIFF file or a JPEG, like then you've doubled that. It'll be slightly smaller, but it's still a significant amount of space. If you migrate it to DNG and you keep all three of these, now we're really talking about a space hog. I don't know why you would keep all three, but I think that there are these like perfect case scenarios or like this like dream of what the workflow should look like, but without really considering the cost or what, like it would be so helpful to have like a dollar amount attached to workflows so that when we do talk to decision makers that they may say, well, we should keep everything. We should say, okay, but this is how much it costs. And like, if you support that, that's fantastic. But I do think it's important to acknowledge that we're talking about multiple copies and the space that it takes. That was more of the previous question.
No, but that is so true. I mean, it's just, I think being good stewards is, and especially, I always get it. Well, it doesn't cost us that much to do that. And it's just like, oh, and it's like, that's where you need to have those quick figures to be able to justify or explain, here's the reasoning. And if you want to spend that much, okay, I'm game. But if you don't want to, then let's get serious here in what we can do. Any other thoughts on that? Has somebody attached, do they have a good model for figuring out the cost analysis on this?
It would seem to me to be a bit tricky to try to do it because there's at least two big categories of costs. There's the storage, proportional to size, which is relatively straightforward, based on whatever your recovery cost for your storage environment. But there's the more intangible sort of expertise cost of someone pulls one of these things out in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and is tasked with doing something meaningful with it. And that could be potentially significant.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And Carol added something about the storage issue in chat. Yeah, conversation around, yeah. The collection came in at 1.5 terabytes, and in evaluating the purpose and value of converting them to MP4 fulfilled the purpose, and it was hundreds of gigabytes instead. Yeah. That sounds like me in our athletic department.
Yeah, if I could respond to that, and
Yes, please.
I'm not. I mean, I understand completely, and I'm not pushing back on this whole way of thinking about it. But this is discussions that we have here all the time, which is purpose. Purpose is, of course, is time bound, and completely contextual. And so this may be a good decision today, but we always have to worry about, again, how well is this decision going to stack up for some, something that someone asks to do tomorrow, for next day. And again, part of the justification for, again, keeping that the richest possible representation is, it allows you that flexibility to tailor your thing to potentially a variety of highly situated purposes. But of course, it comes at a cost. But there's also an opportunity cost. If you've done sort of a destructive conversion, so to speak, where you only keep the derivative outcome, and then suddenly you're forced with a need to do something, and you have to consider whether do I need to reacquire this somehow, and go through the whole process all over again, as opposed to starting from a more intermediate position.
Yeah, Stephen, I definitely agree with you. But we had conversations with the curators and had conversations with the donors, and we confirmed that we weren't responsible for kind of those master files just in case for them. They were like recordings of conference presentations. So the purpose was getting the content out there. It wasn't a high quality video. It wasn't, it was so yeah, definitely there is tons of it depends and a lot of appraisal that needs to go into these before those decisions are made.
You always have to wonder, though, these kinds of curatorial decisions, how much is it made solely on good intellectual grounds, and how much is people looking over their shoulders at their budgets.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, well, we all do. We all have to look over our shoulders at our budgets. So I'm not, I'm no paragon in this regard either. But it's, again, it's hard. It goes back to Jenny's, it depends answer.
Definitely.
It depends on that appraisal, which somebody's got in there too. Yeah, I mean, I think it's always interesting in the archive in the world. You know, it always comes back to appraisal, where people sometimes forget that. And appraisal is so important in our work, so we can make sound decisions. Any other questions, solutions, how you've dealt with things beyond I think we've gotten an, you know, I think it is interesting that, you know, these large collections and how we're dealing with them, you know, that besides storage issues, I can't talk storage issues, but even access and everything else. And how are you good stewards of these records is really the bottom line. Any other questions? Anything up for discussion? Otherwise, I can give you 20 minutes back of your time, but no, Bill, please. Oh, you got to turn your sound on or your mic on.
So, so there are risks in saving a DNG or a raw file, and there are costs associated with it. But I think one of the things that I'm taking away from this conversation is that there's a lot of risk in people outside this conversation not understanding what the DNG, what the raw file is, and thinking that it is going to serve a range of purposes that it is not fit for. So if you're looking at the rendering, of and doing color matching, adjusting things in a DNG viewer, as David said, it's not going to look like that. It's going to look like whatever demosaicing processing application you're looking at. It's not for that. So anyway, I think that's the real risk. And I go back to that comment that a colleague from a museum made. They had made a decision, I've got to think, not really understanding what the risks were in relying heavily on their original camera raw files.
I would add in one last thought too, that if in your capture workflow, I would recommend starting with the raw file, which is what we do, rather than just exporting a JPEG or something out of your camera, which is going to be totally up to how the camera decides to process it, to export out the raw file. Then you can have a color managed workflow. You can capture a color checker target. You can do the white balance for the camera. You can check the exposure. You can check the tonal curve. You can make a custom profile for it if you want. So you can get that really accurate capture in your raw processing software and then export out the TIFF file, which will be the start of what you decide you're going to preserve, whether it be that file or a JPEG 2000 file or a different derivative.
Okay. I am learning so much today with the poor digitization folks here. I'm going to be full of questions for them afterwards too. How are we actually doing that? Any other thoughts? You're welcome. And I thank everybody for coming in today and sharing. This is really, I mean, we're trying to figure out different ways to network and for people to be able to share their expertise as other people are trying to understand things. This is a good community and a good forum for us to do that. So thank you everyone for sharing your thoughts today.
Thank you.
Yep. All righty. I think everybody's gonna get 20 more minutes back from their day. There's sunshine here for the first time in a long time. So I'm gonna go enjoy it. Oh, Carol, you had something you wanted to say? Or she's just waving. I think she's just waving there.
Oh, I don't think so.
Okay, yeah.
I've been typing on my computer.
Yeah.
It was
Okay.
I'm good.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And I didn't have time to look, but there'll be another meeting coming up next month, and you'll be seeing on the NDSA list the details about that. I can't remember if it's the structure and infrastructure one that's up next, I believe. So stay tuned, and hopefully you can join in on their conversations also. So have a great
Very
day,
good.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.